You're listening to the Knowledge Archives podcast. Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines of knowledge as possible. I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm glad to be joined by Dr. Christopher Hassall, an Associate Professor of Biology at the University of Leeds in the UK. Dr. Hassall studies many interdisciplinary areas of knowledge that we can gain from entomology, or the study of insects. I'm very curious to learn more about his findings today. So thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to hear a little bit more about your work and discuss some of the details, especially when applied to all of the different contexts that you've been working in. But first of all, I'd love to ask you to just talk a little bit about your background and some of the areas that you're curious about in terms of your research.
Okay, my name's Chris Hassall. I'm Associate Professor of Animal Biology at the University of Leeds in the UK. My background is mostly in zoology. So I did my undergraduate degree in zoology at the University of Liverpool, stayed on to do a PhD on the impacts of climate change on British dragonflies. I finished that in 2009, moved to Canada, Carleton University for 3 years, working on a variety of topics around global environmental change. And then I moved back to the University of Leeds for a faculty position in 2012, where I've been ever since. My research interests started off very much pure biology, interested in how global change is impacting on ecosystems. But recently I've got interested in a variety of different topics, from how we manage urban populations of invasive species, how people in cities are influenced by the nature around them. I'm interested in questions that have a deeper evolutionary link, things like the evolution of mimicry and insect and animal coloration. And I have a strong interest in climate change, which comes from my doctoral research at Liverpool as well. More recently, we've got a big project working on the use of weather radar networks to look at insect abundance and diversity. So I very much try to work with whatever disciplines best help to answer the questions that I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm. And it will be very interesting to look into all of those different areas, especially the ones like biomimicry and climate change. But first of all, I just wanted to ask you about the different areas that you're working in right now. How did they stem from just like working in pure biology at first? And what kind of connections are there between these interdisciplinary fields that might not be obvious to someone who hasn't done this work?
That's a really interesting question. There is definitely an element of chance, of serendipity to the way that my career has developed. I started, as I've said, with the idea that the global climate is influencing insect populations. And so we can both study how those insects, my dragonflies in this case, were responding. And through that study, we can also learn more about how the general global environment might respond to climatic change. However, I got interested in how different aspects of global change might impact on ecosystems. And so I started doing some work on urbanization, on how cities and the development of cities can impact ecosystems. Once you start working in cities, you realize that conservation biologists have very little sway in those cities. In order to do any good for local natural systems, you need to be working with the local people in order to understand their needs and their attitudes. You need to work with policymakers who are actually making the change on the ground. And so that ended up with me studying not only the natural, but also the social and economic systems that happen within those urban settings. So from there, I've got interested in environmental psychology and a little bit of behavioral economics as well. That then led on to ideas of how we monitor the environment. And so we can use traditional ecological techniques, sure, and that was the bedrock of my training. I was working with butterfly nets and killing jars, just like Victorian naturalists were doing 100 years ago. But there's only so much that you can achieve in terms of environmental monitoring and assessment with those sorts of old-fashioned techniques. And so I got interested in new sources of data to understand the environment. one of which was looking at bioacoustics. And so we're using techniques to record sounds in the environment and extract biological information. So how many birds are there? How many insect buzzes do we hear? And using that sort of technology and the computational tools that come with it, we can start to monitor the environment in really a completely different way. The most recent project looking at the use of weather radar came about just because of a chance conversation at an event with an atmospheric physicist who also works at the University of Leeds. And he and I were chatting, and I said I work on bees and dragonflies and other insects. And he said that he works on radar and he sees bees in his radar all the time, and he takes those data and he throws them away because they aren't weather. He only cares in his wind, rain, hail, snow. And so we realized at that point that there was a really interesting project that could be done if we combined the natural and the atmospheric sciences. And that was about 3 or 4 years ago now. And we've got a very successful collaboration going now with a couple of research grants and a few researchers working on those projects. So yeah, the answer to your question, I suppose, is partly there's a natural evolution. As you move towards trying to solve problems, you realize that you can't just do that with biology. But also sometimes chance encounters lead to the combination of ideas and approaches that become more than the sum of their parts.
Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting to hear about how, exactly as you mentioned, the idea of serendipity comes into play with the chance interactions you were mentioning, but also your own natural curiosity to learn about these issues and actually to whatever it takes, even if it is a different discipline, to find these new insights to solve problems. And when it comes to the stories you told about the new approaches that you've been able to find with your work, it's very interesting to think about how that influences how you're going about making observations or running the research studies. And when it comes to the effects of this, so if you are analyzing the effects of ecosystem change, of global change in an economic context or in a social context, or from the perspective of the local, say, politicians involved, what are some of the implications you've been able to find for how these things like urbanization and climate change impact insects, but also what the effect of that might be on, say, the local economy or the local even environmental context or legislative context, etc.?
Yes, there are huge issues when we try to scale up from biodiversity science to the social, economic, and policy areas. For a start, we know that the natural system is absolutely core to the healthy functioning of human society. Without the planet and its resources, we wouldn't be able to survive, and we wouldn't be able to enjoy the quality of life that we do enjoy. But the economists and policymakers want us to put numbers on it, pounds and pence or dollars and cents. And that's a real challenge because, for the most part, the ecosystem, the ecological systems, the natural systems on which we rely are too complex and interrelated to be able to do that in a comprehensive way. So, I mean, one of the few areas of natural resources that we have quantified to any extent is that of pollinators, pollinating insects. And I think the numbers are somewhere around the hundreds of billions of US dollars every year that those insects are worth to the global economy in terms of food production. So if we didn't have those insects, how much more would we have to spend in order to be able to produce the food that would be lost? Other types of valuation, though, are extremely difficult. One that I'm currently struggling with at the moment is if you have a particular natural habitat within a city, there are cultural ecosystem services. So these are services that people benefit from because the environment looks nice and it makes them feel good. They enjoy spending time in that space. Or perhaps it's an educational experience for people to go out and experience nature in a particular way. Now, those sorts of valuations are immensely complex. I mean, do you ask people how much they would be willing to pay to conserve that space? That's one approach. One approach that we're thinking of taking is you can try to calculate how many lesson plans you could derive from a given space for a teacher. And then if you value a particular year of education, how much is that space potentially worth as a teaching resource? But it's massively difficult to do this kind of work, even working in an interdisciplinary way. And that fundamentally is a key challenge to trying to advocate for greater resources for the conservation of nature, whether it's in cities or elsewhere. The policymakers are an interesting beast because they're often influenced by the economics of a given situation, but they can be swayed by new technologies, new approaches, buzzwords. And so selling an idea to a policymaker can involve not just the economics of the situation, but a higher level strategic angle. So, for example, the weather radar project that we're running that's trying to measure insect abundance in the field, there's a series of new policy instruments going through UK government at the moment, looking at how to manage the countryside, both for agriculture and for the natural environment. And so there's a potential use for the sorts of techniques that we're developing to monitor the success of those new policy instruments. So we can, to a certain extent, make a case for the research and the natural resources that we study on the basis of this need to manage the landscape for policymakers as well, beyond simply the pounds and pence, dollars and cents valuation of those resources.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, regarding the reasons to study the ecosystems and study entomology and insects in general, obviously there's the need for that kind of data to make decisions for policymakers. And you also talked about some of the reasons that these insects might be very important for economies, especially in the context of pollinators and agricultural industries. What are, even like scaling that back, not in terms of the macro effects, but I guess this relates more to your research with biomimicry. What are some of the insights that we can derive from studying entomology in particular? So specifically insects, how they work, how they go about interacting with their environment, etc. And then studying how they make up a foundational part of the ecosystem around them.
That's a big question. Biomimicry is a constantly evolving field, but there are some really good insect-related examples. For example, insect flight has definitely been an inspiration for biomimetic engineering. Until now, the sorts of applications that we were looking at were relatively limited. They tried to imitate flying insects, but there were issues with power consumption and battery life, and therefore the range at which these robots could operate. However, in recent years, with increased funding from the military, in fact, there's been a suite of bio-inspired micro drones that are comparable really to the size and functioning of dragonflies, which have been developed. And they are extremely impressive. I mean, it really has, it's a technology in terms of bio-inspired micro drones that is very much matured over the last year or so. And people would be able to find out some examples if they go online and search for those dragonfly drones. Other areas of research that have been inspired by insects, well, there's a whole suite of agricultural research that has taken the pollinators as an inspiration for how to maintain crops. So, for example, some bumblebees will buzz at a certain pitch in order to release the pollen from flowers as they go around pollinating. And so we've adopted that sort of pitch. We have small instruments that we use to extract pollen from particular types of flowers for use in horticulture. In terms of other kinds of inspiration, one that I'd really like to see, again thinking about my dragonflies, is that the dragonfly larvae swim by a form of jet propulsion. Now, this is something that engineers haven't really exploited as much as perhaps they could have. But the hydraulics within a dragonfly are really fascinating, and I think could yield some interesting insights. There's been a little bit of bio-inspired jet propulsion through imitation of squid, for example, but not yet dragonflies. Thinking about how they operate at an ecosystem level, how they function in terms of supporting ecosystems, there are interesting questions around their life histories. And so to what extent can we make use of their larvae, the early stage of their life history, as a food source, just like other animals do? Anybody who's seen the most recent Blade Runner film will have seen that a lot of the protein sources for people in that imagined future come from insect larvae farmed in small-scale agriculture. And that potentially is only a few years away, and there's plenty of cultures around the UK, around the world rather, that already exploit insects as a food source. Understanding how they underpin other aspects of the environment is something that we're really only just understanding now. For example, we tend to do this by accident. When we eliminate large numbers of insects, we tend to see the impacts further up the food chain. A good example of this is in the Camargue region of France, where there was large-scale spraying to eliminate mosquitoes, which were a nuisance to local people. But what you see after that is that the local swallow populations, the birds that feed on the mosquitoes, decline in number. And so this is just one example of how complex these ecological systems are, and how little really we understand the important role that the insects play within them.
Mm-hmm. And given that importance, one other thing that makes me curious is how oftentimes you mention the examples of specific species that, say, engineers really settle down to study. And obviously, it's not just the engineers. You also need people who are biologists and are part of other disciplines to get together to share these insights. When it comes to these kinds of interactions, I wonder how much it's the case that there are a few species that, say, might seem interesting to a biologist or to one scientist, and because of that, because of their expertise with that one species, the particular species gets a lot of research focused on it. I know in your particular research, you often do work with dragonflies and specific species like that. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the number of species of insects, it vastly exceeds the number of mammalian species. Is that correct?
Definitely, yes. There's a famous quote by the biologist Bob May, who said that to a first approximation, all animals are insects. Everything else is negligible compared to the sheer diversity of insects, yes.
Yeah. And when I think about that, I wonder how much do you think there is, you mentioned all of the complexity when it comes to environmental interactions and ecological interactions with just a few key species of insects, but how much do you think there is still unknown when it comes to the number of insect species we haven't studied, and especially with the species loss that we're currently facing, the potential that we're losing to study these new applications, whether they be for biomimicry or for the agricultural industry, etc.
Well, the current decline in insects is certainly a massive lost opportunity. The insect declines are really the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we've described. There's a huge, great neglected majority of extinctions that are currently going on and that we know almost nothing about because oftentimes we haven't even discovered or named the species that has gone extinct. So absolutely there is a problem there. As to the potential for what we might call bioprospecting, that is, exploring biodiversity for potential use in some way, whether it's engineering or medicine, undoubtedly there are opportunities there. We'd like to think that we've discovered broadly the diversity of potential types of insect that might be out there. It's unlikely that we're going to discover any new groups, although it is possible. Certainly there are areas of the world that we haven't explored to their fullest. And within those, well, even within those species that we currently know well, that we're still discovering exciting new findings. We're discovering new enzymes, for example, that will break down plastic and cellulose. We're discovering new genetic adaptations that allow animals to live in places that we'd never thought possible. And so while there are a small number of species that have received enormous amounts of attention from the scientific community, and the fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster, is perhaps the classic example, there's definitely an awful lot of information that can still be drawn out of the animals that we don't yet know about. In terms of the importance of preventing declines for wider ecosystem function, there's an interesting metaphor that I learned about when I was an undergraduate student, and that is what's called the rivet hypothesis. Many people think that because there are a lot of insects around, both in terms of the sheer number of them and the number of types, that we can afford to lose a few before the natural systems start to struggle. And that may be true, but what the rivet hypothesis suggests is that the natural systems are like an aeroplane. Aeroplanes have an awful lot of rivets that hold the wings onto the fuselage and keep the aeroplane in the air. As you start to lose rivets, your wings aren't going to fly off after you lose the first few. But eventually you're going to get to the stage where losing many more rivets is going to reach a tipping point. And that's when the wings fly off. And so what we don't know in terms of insect conservation and biodiversity conservation more generally is what all of these different species are doing in the natural system and how many more of these species we can lose before these systems start to collapse. And it's that ignorance about their value to the natural systems in which they operate and their potential value in terms of bioprospecting for medicine and engineering, that those are two very good arguments, in my opinion, for trying to stop these substantial declines in insects as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm. And I think that does a lot to answer some of the most pressing areas that still need future research when it comes to this topic. And I lastly wanted to just ask you some questions more about yourself than, I guess, the scientific or research-driven area of things. One of them is, what are some of the areas of research that you're most excited to work on or see more work on by others in the next 5 years?
I suppose I'll speak to my own interests in terms of my career first. My favorite project at the moment that I'm working on is this idea about using weather radar networks to map insect populations. There is this problem with the limitation of the data that we have for detecting insect declines. And the fact that weather radars have potentially been recording information on insects for decades in some cases, and that we can tap into that huge treasure trove of information about biodiversity is very exciting to me. We're exploring this in the UK at the moment and quickly trying to develop it as an international approach. So that, in terms of current ongoing work, is what I'm most excited about. And it's part of a wider surge in the use of technology for answering biodiversity related questions. Others might be the rapidly developing field of genomics, and in particular environmental DNA, where we try to detect animals in the environment through the trace amounts of genetic material they leave behind in their environment. There's a whole suite of really great engineering technology related solutions to big biodiversity problems. Stepping back from the technology though, I'm really fascinated by the social science aspects of what I do. And, I'm completely open with the fact that I do social science as an ecologist and very badly. But the sorts of questions I'm interested in are, how do you influence people's opinions about sustainability and the environment in a positive way? How do you engage a diversity of different types of people from different demographic backgrounds in order to inform them of the facts of environmental problems without necessarily pushing them away? There's a lot of evidence now that people with particular socio-political leanings might be put off by the sorts of messaging that conservation biologists will use. All this doom and gloom narrative, for example, that you hear in the media about Insectageddon and environmental apocalypse, that's not a very inclusive way to bring the general public with us. So it leaves us with the interesting question, well, okay, how do we go about bringing the general public with us? And there's some ideas around how we can frame these things more positively. So, for example, we don't protect these insects so we don't lose them. We protect them because they have a potential benefit to us. So these arguments that pollinators have this $200 billion a year benefit to the global economy, for example, rather than the fact that the insects are going to be lost. So it's reframing the narrative in order to address different demographic groups. And the creative ways that we do it as well. What impact can art and creative writing have in terms of communicating science generally and sustainability and biodiversity in particular? There's a whole field of the science of science communication that weaves together science and biodiversity, social science, as well as the arts and humanities into a single unit that can be a really fascinating place for researchers from all of those different disciplines to occupy and exchange ideas. And so that's not something that I think will ever be well funded, but I find it a fascinating area. I'd love to see a lot more work done in that space.
Yes, those are all very, very interesting areas, and it's really, really amazing to see how you're able to think about not just this specific discipline, but also how it can be correlated with all these other disciplines. And that leads into my final question for you, which is just in your personal journey. It's obvious how much you've learned over time when it comes to not just working as an ecologist, but working across a lot of different disciplines and also learning from the other colleagues that you've met from other disciplines and trying to see where connections can be made across these different disciplines. How would you suggest that other people who maybe are starting out in their academic careers, how much would you place an importance on the value of learning about interdisciplinary areas? And do you have any tips, for instance, of how to do that when it comes to, say, a postgrad student starting out in academia?
Well, for me, there's a tension in academia between trying to probe fundamental questions in a given field, in which case a researcher or a student would want to delve deep into subject-specific information, develop new ideas, and explore their particular subjects in much greater detail. There's a tension between that kind of fundamental biology or fundamental research and a more practical, applied, problem-oriented research paradigm where the problems that you're trying to solve in the real world cannot be reduced to simple fundamental principles. You have to take into account social, economic, and natural systems, which are hugely complex individually and that interact in even more complex ways. Now, the sort of interdisciplinarity that I would advocate for is essential if you're going to even consider addressing real world problems. And so that's definitely the argument that I would make for engaging with information outside of your area of interest. In terms of how you go about doing that, I think you just need to be open to opportunity and you need to invest the time in it. It's not something that you can really pick up if you are dedicated to a particular narrow perspective on a subject. There is an issue with students trying to get good grades, with early career faculty trying to establish themselves in their fields, and even with senior faculty, senior professors who are trying to maintain their status on the world stage, that there's so little time to be able to invest in what might be seen as indulgences in these different disciplines. But for me, that for me is one of the most interesting and exciting aspects of my career, and I'm really very lucky that by investing time in learning about atmospheric science and creative writing and environmental psychology, I've been able to derive quite a lot of return on that investment in terms of really great colleagues who I find stimulating, some small amounts of grant funding here and there, and some publications in the academic literature that I'm really quite proud of. So my advice is certainly to seek out things that are outside of your discipline. Do invest the time, and even if there's no tangible reward at the end, I think you'll become a much better read and well-rounded member of the public, student, or researcher as a result.
And I think that's a very great practical note to end off on. So thank you for taking the time to talk about your stories and also this very, very interesting field when it comes to insect ecology and how it connects to all of the other areas we talked about. And I'm sure that a bunch of people learned something new that they really hadn't thought too much about in the past.
You're welcome, and thanks for having me.